Why do millennials seem less interested in owning things than previous generations? Older generations often measure success through milestones like owning a house, buying a car, or building a collection of things that represent stability. But millennials frequently spend money in a different way. Instead of focusing on ownership, they often prioritize travel, events, food, and shared experiences. This difference has puzzled many people who grew up in earlier decades. But when you look closely at the world millennials entered as adults, their priorities begin to make more sense. Before we go further, tell me where you're watching from and which generation you belong to. Because depending on when you grew up, this shift might feel completely logical or slightly confusing. For much of the 20th century, ownership was one of the clearest symbols of progress. Buying a home meant stability. Owning a car meant independence. Collecting furniture, appliances, and personal belongings meant building a life. For baby boomers especially, these milestones represented success because they reflected the economic environment they grew up in. The decades after World War II were defined by expansion. Housing was affordable. Wages grew steadily. And long-term employment was common. For many people during that period, ownership wasn't just possible, it was expected. Gen X inherited much of that same cultural script. The idea that adulthood meant building a stable life through ownership remained strong. But millennials entered adulthood during a very different moment in history. Many came of age during or shortly after the global financial crisis of 2008. Housing prices rose dramatically. Student debt became widespread. Stable long-term careers became less predictable. Suddenly, the traditional path toward ownership looked less secure than it had for previous generations. When economic stability becomes uncertain, people often begin to rethink what success looks like. For millennials, this meant shifting attention toward things that felt more accessible and meaningful. Experiences, travel, social activities, moments that could be shared with friends or remembered later. This shift wasn't simply about preference. It was shaped by the economic conditions surrounding the generation. But economics is only part of the story. Technology also played a major role. Millennials were the first generation to grow up alongside the internet as it rapidly expanded. Social media platforms emerged during their young adulthood. These platforms encouraged people to share experiences, photos from trips, meals with friends, concerts, festivals, and adventures. Experiences became visible in a way that possessions never had been before. A house might symbolize stability, but a photo from a memorable trip could instantly connect someone with hundreds of friends. Over time, experiences became a kind of social currency. Not because people were pretending to enjoy them, but because experiences translated easily into stories and memories. They were inherently shareable. Psychologists have also studied another reason experiences tend to feel more meaningful than possessions. Objects usually provide excitement when they are first acquired. A new phone, a new piece of furniture, a new car. But over time, people adapt to those objects. They become part of the background of everyday life. Experiences behave differently. Trips, events, and activities often create lasting memories. People remember who they were with, how they felt, and what made the moment unique. Even years later, recalling those moments can recreate the positive emotion attached to them. That difference changes how people evaluate where their money goes. For millennials, investing in experiences often feels more emotionally rewarding than accumulating possessions. Another cultural factor also influenced this shift. Mobility. Previous generations often stayed in the same city or region for long periods. Owning large amounts of furniture, appliances, and personal belongings made sense in a stable environment. Millennials entered a workforce that required greater flexibility. Moving between cities for jobs became more common. Renting became more common. Remote work began to expand. In a world where people move more often, owning fewer physical things can actually make life easier. Experiences, by contrast, don't need to be packed into boxes. They move with you as memories. There is also a deeper psychological layer to this generational shift. Millennials grew up during a period when identity became more fluid and self-directed. Previous generations often followed clearer social scripts. Finish school, find a stable job, buy a house, build a family. That structure provided a predictable framework for adulthood. Millennials entered adulthood during a period where those scripts began to loosen. Career paths became less linear. Work changed faster. Technology reshaped industries. When the structure of adulthood becomes less predictable, people often look for meaning in other places. Experiences offer a sense of identity. Travel shapes how people see the world. Events and gatherings strengthen social bonds. Shared experiences help people feel connected to others. And for a generation navigating rapid change, those connections can feel especially important. This shift also shows up in how millennials talk about success. Instead of focusing only on financial milestones, many describe success through lifestyle. Freedom, flexibility, memories created with friends or family, opportunities to explore new places. That perspective doesn't mean millennials reject ownership entirely. Many still want homes, stability, and long-term investments. But the order of priorities often looks different. Experiences first, ownership later. In some ways, this shift reflects a deeper cultural realization. Possessions can represent security, but experiences shape identity. Objects can fill space in a house. Experiences tend to fill space in memory. That difference becomes more noticeable in a world where social interaction, communication, and storytelling increasingly happen online. A photo from a trip often sparks conversation. A memory shared with friends can be retold for years. Experiences carry narrative, and humans have always been drawn to stories. Another interesting pattern appears when researchers compare how different generations evaluate spending. Younger generations often report feeling happier after spending money on experiences rather than objects. Older generations sometimes report the opposite. But when people look back later in life, experiences tend to stand out more clearly in memory. Trips, adventures, shared celebrations, moments that broke the routine of everyday life. The cultural shift toward experiences isn't simply about preference. It reflects the economic conditions, technological environment, and social expectations that shaped the generation. Each generation adapts to the world it inherits. Baby boomers built stability in a time of expansion. Gen X navigated economic shifts and cultural change. Millennials entered adulthood during financial uncertainty and rapid technological transformation. Their priorities evolved accordingly. What looks unusual from one generational perspective often makes perfect sense from another. And that's the pattern that appears again and again throughout history. The environment changes. Technology evolves. Economic conditions shift. And each generation adapts in ways that feel natural to them. For some generations, success meant building a life through ownership. For others, it increasingly means building a life through experiences. Neither approach is inherently better. They simply reflect different moments in time. The behaviors that seem strange today often become normal tomorrow. Every generation grows up believing its habits are simply the way the world works, until the next generation quietly starts doing things differently. And only then does the pattern become visible. And once you start seeing that pattern clearly, it begins to show up in far more areas than just money or possessions. And that's where a much deeper shift starts to reveal itself that most people never fully connect.